Happy to be here. Before I started my journey in doing production cost modeling in 1999, so 25 years ago, right? Just same, same as the anniversary of Energy Exemplar. I think Energy Exemplar was a nobody back in 1999. So it's, but back then in 1999, I had a very sophisticated machine learning capacity expansion model, right? It was called brute force, manually put in a combined cycle, run the model, check the results, brute force another combined cycle, brute force another gas turbine, manually check the results, and just do this iterative process. So I think now we've come a long ways in terms of long-term LTCEs. So Filsinger Energy Partners, we've been running Aurora we've been running Aurora for the past since I think 2012. We use it as the backbone of all our analysis to help with mergers and acquisitions. We do some price forecasting, but it enables us to give a view of the trends that are happening in the electric power space. So in this presentation, I was tasked to produce a zero carbon power sector for the entire U.S. So I know the Hari before did it for ERCOT, and he made some assumptions. And I think the scale of the problem is really difficult, right? So with the benefit of Energy Exemplar's Aurora model, we're able to run the Eastern Interconnect, the WCC, and the ERCOT model, pretty much overnight. So think about that. We're the whole system overnight across, several machines. And we're not doing cloud at this moment, but we have fast enough machines to be able to parallelize the results and be able to really, really get both the long-term capacity expansion plan and the zonal unit commitment and dispatch, from all the way out to 2050. So in this presentation, I'm going to give you some lessons learned in terms of modeling the system. And let me just tell you, it was pretty hard, right? You have to make a lot of assumptions. There are a lot of things that you don't think about until you start modeling the system. We did a business as usual case for comparison. I'm not going to focus on the business as usual case, but I'm going to focus on what we did and the type of modeling we did to get to zero carbon. And that include retiring all the existing thermal resources, all the coal, all the natural gas, so everything, so zero carbon, not net zero, zero carbon, right? So there's a lot of challenges. There's no backup capacity there. So if you look at this chart, right, some of you might look at this as, hey, we're going to build a lot of renewables and a lot of battery storage, right? Well, I look at this and what the takeaway is for me, we can't really predict the future. Because if you keep going back in the past and you see the types of resources that are being built, right, we're consistently wrong on long-term forecast, right? Whether it's the nuclear age or the coal age, or when I started in the early 2000s where it was only gas. So every forecast was, let's just build gas, right? So here we are in the intersection and we think, okay, we're gonna build a lot of solar, a lot of wind, a lot of batteries. And there's discussions about, do we build SMRs? Do we build hydrogen? Do we build some other technology? The truth is, we don't know at this point, right? And I did this presentation for a banking group a couple weeks ago, and some of the big takeaways I got from the banking sector was that the only bankable technologies today are solar, wind, and lithium-ion batteries. Nuclear, SMRs, long-duration storage technologies, while they have a lot of promise, they're not bankable. So right now, we model it, but it's not bankable. Major problem of renewables is the transmission. So a lot of the previous speakers have talked about the transmission constraint, and I think if you look at the big picture and you step back and say, where are all the renewables? It's in the Midwest for the wind, and in the south and the southwest part of the U.S. it's the solar, right? So I think if you're going to get to zero carbon across the U.S., right, you're going to have to build a lot of transmission across the U.S., not just like local transmission, but regional transmission. WCC is a good example. If CAISO was just to look within California for renewables, right, you would never get to those goals of zero carbon by 2045, right? So CAISO in their transmission planning process has looked at other resources. You got Trans-West Express that started out, starts in Wyoming, goes to Las Vegas, and then the CAISO, right? So interestingly enough about Trans-West Express, I first started working on that project, or worked on the project in 2008 to look at that project, right? And I think the latest estimates that just got approved, I think first segment might be under construction, right? Probably, 2027, 28 might be, fully complete. So that's about 20 years. So think about as the lead time for transmission, right? It's not like, hey, if we plan for it, for 5 years from now, it's going to happen. It's going to probably be a lot longer. Although probably the latest merchant projects like SunZia, and there's a couple other ones out there, they've happened a lot quicker. So there's a lot of hope that if you can build a lot of transmission, eliminate some of those barriers to, all the NIMBY issues, you can get access to the renewables. Earlier today, I think in the general session, I think the lady from New York ISO, she kind of highlighted, okay, we have a challenge to get to zero carbon by 2040, so even before California, right? And I think it's important to understand the scale of the problem, right? It's easy to do it on paper, but it's very difficult to really understand how difficult it's going to be, right? So in New York, you see that, here we are in 2021 based upon their long-term outlook, and then by 2040, they're going to have to build all these resources. So they have to retire 26 gigawatts of capacity in New York City, right? And guess what? Most of the capacity, it's in New York City, Long Island, right? Are you going to build SMRs? Are you going to build hydrogen? What are you going to build? Right? It's something, right? And that's a question, right? And then us as planners, when we model the system, we put in a generic resource, right? And that's just a fill-in, right? But here we are playing real world planning, right? You got to put in something. So New York forecast, you have to build 45 megawatts of dispatchable emission-free resources. That's a lot. I don't know where it's going to come from, but that's sort of the challenge that comes with getting to zero carbon and decarbonizing the power sector. Here's another chart. In 2023, the US generated 4 billion megawatt hours of energy. Let's just think about energy. Forget about capacity at this point. We have to replace at least, at a minimum, that much energy with clean energy. How much will it take? Well, this is how much you have to build in order to replace it. So if you're going to replace all that energy with solar, right, you need 1.5 million megawatts of solar. If you want to do it with wind, a little less, higher capacity factor. If you want to do it with nuclear, 500,000 megawatts, right? That's before we talk about generative AI and data centers and load growth, right? So that's not, that's a pretty difficult thing to do, right? So it's a lot of resources, and we're going to have to build a lot to get there. The other key insight that, in getting to zero carbon is the system's changing, right? You talk about energy transition, right? And a lot of us are conditioned to talk about capacity and having enough capacity. So in traditional utility planning, 15 to 18% reserve margin equates to a 1 day in 10, right? So if it's Aurora or Plexus, right? If you put in the reserve margin, you say, okay, I built to the 15% reserve margin, you have a reliable system. The problem is when you get to 2050 or whatever your end date is to get to a decarbonized system, right? It's not a capacity problem. It's an energy problem, right? And one of the key things I'm starting to realize is that, we talk about ELCC. I've done ELCC studies, and every, ISO does an ELCC study, every consultant does an ELCC study. The problem with the ELCC is it's a very dynamic number, right? It's dependent upon, what's your penetration level, how much batteries you have, what's your shape. So chances are, if you're picking an ELCC out of a study and sticking it into your model, you're probably wrong. And that's a problem I face too, right? because we're looking at reserve margin and ELCC as being the be-all, end-all. If we get the reserve margin, we have a reliable system. But one of the takeaways, at least I think of that, we may have people that disagree, right, is that if you do ELCC, right, if you get the ELCC wrong, your reserve margin is wrong, right? You don't have an idea if your system is overbuilt or underbuilt, especially if you're running a deterministic system, right? You're just saying, okay, here's my typical day, typical 8760 solar shape or typical 8760 wind shape, and you run the system and you run a deterministic case and you get no energy not served or no loss of load, and you say, well, I have a reliable system. But the problem is when you're building out a system to meet zero carbon, right, you're adding a lot of intermittent resources, right? So those intermittent resources, right, you don't know if they're going to show up. And I think one of the things I do see quite a bit for the assumption from my clients, developers, is sort of an underestimation of how intermittent solar and wind resources are. An alternative to ELCC is something the CAISO or the California is looking at. So they're looking at revamping the way to do ELCC. So instead of having to calculate ELCC based upon different penetration levels of wind, solar, they're looking at another method called the exceedance method, right? So they're looking at a slice of day. So they're saying if you can cover your worst day every month, you have a reliable system, right? And one of the beauties of this exceedance system is that you're doing capacity accreditation based upon historical or some calculated number on the performance of solar and wind, right? So you're looking at, and of course there's debate of what type of exceedance that you're looking at, right? But this type of calculation isn't dependent upon, well, I had 8 gigawatts of battery and 6 gigawatts of solar, and it's a complex calculation. This is kind of an independent calculation. I'm not saying it's sort of the only method out there, but it's something that's different than ELCC. I do believe that it's a little bit better approach because it's the equivalent of, instead of having a reserve margin on the peak hour, it's a sort of an hourly reserve margin on the worst day, right? So you have to maintain your reserve margin of, let's say, if you want 17%, you have to maintain 17% reserve margin on your worst day, and that's assuming that your solar may not show up, right? So it's not assuming the best case scenario, but it's not looking the worst case scenario. So we can debate about what level of exceedance that you get from solar and wind, but that's an alternative approach, but factors in because we know that renewables are intermittent. And here's an example. This is ERCOT from last year. This is two weeks last year in August. First week, average 11,000 average megawatts for the week. The next week, we went to 8,000. Average energy changed by 30% just for the week. If you look on a day-over-day basis, the change, the variance was anywhere from 57%, minus 57% to 61%, right? So if you look at Monday to Monday, Tuesday to Tuesday, right, there's a whole lot of variance, right? And that's what causes scarcity in ERCOT when they get in trouble. The load gets really high and the wind doesn't show up. So what do you plan for, right? That's the problem with resource planning. So if it's a problem now, right, and we get to a system where it's 80, 90% intermittent energy, we're going to have a big problem. Of course, you can build a lot of storage, right? But if the wind doesn't blow for a week, right, you don't have enough energy to power your batteries. So I think we talk about another lesson that we learned from this modeling is we put in all these resources and we said, okay, let's let the model pick different types of resources ranging from solar, wind, energy storage. And we gave it two different types of energy storage, a 4-hour battery and a 10-hour battery. We gave it hydrogen as an option and also SMRs, right? And I think the beauty of it is that we were able to run this in Aurora. So I didn't manually have to do my artificial intelligence and brute force the expansion plan. So we used the Aurora expansion plan, the LTC from Aurora, and able to turn around most of the runs overnight. And it was still an iterative process to kind of look at the results, see it makes sense, make sure that the reliability requirements were being met. But it was doable. The results of the model is that, here are the results of the case, right? So in our business as usual case, we see that natural gas is still 30% of the resource mix. And I think, in our base case, we see that it's actually pretty easy to get to the 60, 70%, sort of clean energy standard. It's when you start getting into the last 10, 15%, that's when the cost and the technology becomes a lot more challenging. In the zero carbon case, 32% of the mix is solar. A good deal is wind, but also a big chunk of it is the nuclear, right? So in our model, we picked SMR, right? It could be hydrogen, right? I think our Hari earlier, chose to do hydrogen, right? But whether it's hydrogen or SMR, right? It's a placeholder at this point because we don't know really is SMR cheaper or is hydrogen cheaper, right? They're both promising technologies, but both have a lot of red flags. And this is the other problem that I think Hari touched upon, right? So when we do our modeling, right, we add a lot of renewables, and eventually the energy price gets down to close to zero. So this chart shows average cost of the system versus marginal cost, right? And you see there's a divergence in that, right? So the average cost is essentially all your fixed capital, variable fuel costs rolled into it, right? Your all-in average, all-in cost is the marginal cost, but with the capacity cost included, converted from $1 per kilowatt year into $1 per megawatt hour number, right? So what does that tell us when there's a divergence? Does anyone want to venture a guess? I'm out of a job in about 2032. Market's broken, right? Why do you need to hire a consultant? Market doesn't tell you what you need to know, right? It's all average cost. So that's one of the inflection points, right? I think we're not there yet, right? But if you keep going down the track where you add more renewables, you keep driving down the price, the market doesn't work anymore, right? Well, you know what saves this market? If there's a pathway to keep this market working. RECs, ZECs, and other, sort of REC attributes, right? Because I think theoretically, if you look at the delta between the green line and the red line, right? That's the REC price, right? So if you fill in the energy price and say, well, there's not enough money in the energy price, it's the REC price or the ZEC price. That's the difference, right? But that's two ways of looking at it, right? So this is a decarbonized system. It's the average cost versus the marginal cost, and that's one of the topics that we kind of talk about a lot. And it's like if you keep adding renewables, the price becomes to be zero eventually, right? So do the markets work anymore? But utilities, they don't look at the market price, right? You're doing IRPs, you're looking at your NPV, total system cost, right? Nope. And I think that's my presentation. So I want to keep it short and leave time for Q&A.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation, Benson. I absolutely loved it. Thank you. I have a million questions, but do you have an estimate of the cost delta between your base case and the zero carbon case?
I do. I didn't want to show it because it could be controversial. The reality is, I'll tell you. If you look at the actual cost difference and how it would filter down to the ratepayer, the retail rates, it's pretty expensive. I would probably say it's an order of magnitude. If you look at sort of the end state of 2050, it's probably 30 to 40% higher, right? And a lot of that is because we're retiring existing gas, adding SMRs, right? The reality is, if our gas, the implied gas price that we use is in that, $3, $4, $5 range in the back end, right? So, if you're talking about gas in an existing combined cycle in the business usual case, right, it's $5 gas times 7,000 heat rate. You're talking about $35 megawatt hour, right? Well, depending on what your sources are for SMRs and hydrogen, right? I mean, SMRs and hydrogen are going to be well over $100. Right, so, and that's what's driving the difference, is that unless there's a breakthrough in the cost, right, it's really hard to beat natural gas at a low price, right? Of course, if you think, gas prices are going to be $10, right, well, then solar is going to make a lot of sense. But if you think gas prices are going to be cheaper, right, it's going to be more expensive, because is there a technology out there that can beat, your system costs at $3 to $4 gas? So I think that's the trouble. I mean, we could sit here now and say, okay, renewables is cheap. And this is with the IRA, right? And of course, remember, the IRA phases out, right? At 75% reduction, it does phase out. And so, it's unclear, do you get an extension on that or not? So, the modeling we did was a lot more detail. I think for the purposes of this presentation, I just want to give you a flavor of the stuff that we did, and we can talk offline, for anybody who wants to go deeper into the details. But I think I think I'm pretty amazed by the computing power of the software that's available now, because this is stuff that we couldn't do in 1999, right? If I had to manually kind of do these expansion plans, right, it would take forever, right? I'd be working like 3-4 weeks without any sleep.
Have you guys spent any time thinking about the implications of rate structures that could support a future vision like this? I mean, obviously, it's got to move to fixed costs, right? You made that point with the renewable energy credit. Mm-hmm. But how would that translate to consumers potentially in a palatable way?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because I think this is more of a thought exercise. Like, okay, what if, let's say, and this is one pathway, right? There's, and there's multiple pathways to get in there, right? And it depends on the assumptions. But, the assumptions I use are primarily from NREL public sources, right? And they're like reasonable assumptions. I'm not using sort of like, oh yeah, SMRs could be $40, right? I'm using stuff that like, there's got to be a lot of breakthroughs, right? And there's, when I think about this, and people ask me, well, what's the probability of this zero carbon happening, right? Oh, the reality is you need about 10 different things to break your way in order for make it to work. It's like going to Las Vegas and doing a 12-team parlay and saying, well, yeah, you might hit on 5 of them, but can you do all 12?
So then the second question is, how do you avoid getting lynched at parties in Denver when you say that to people?
Yeah, you don't talk about costs. I'm from California. I'll get, it's even worse.
A question in terms of the looking at the expansion. Obviously, it's a lot of solar and wind. Did you take a look at land usage that those new builds would require, and if there's actually space for that in the markets that they're needed?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of studies out there. If you look at the potential for wind and solar, the land is out there, right? There's plenty of land, even way more than it's needed to get to that point, right? Even offshore wind, there's plenty of that, right? I think really the problem is going to be the transmission, right? Can you build enough transmission? But in terms of physical land, the potential's there, and there's enough out there that you can build it, right? Some of it, of course, is not as high quality, right? But it's there. That's not at least I haven't heard of that being a constraint. The constraint is really more going to be on the, sort of the cost, the interconnection, the transmission, right? Is like, I'm doing this on paper, right? I can just, add 100 gigawatts of SMRs and not even blink an eye, right? In reality, like, it's going to be way harder than that, right? I mean, I think I forgot the exact number, but I think I added, over 100 gigawatts of SMRs, because how do you get off of gas? I mean, that's the hardest problem, is that all the low hanging fruit is kind of being taken away. It's all the low hanging fruit is you build all the solar, build all the storage, right? But then you still have a lot of gas in your system for the last 30-40%. Well, really at that point, the solutions are going to be SMRs, hydrogen, maybe some seasonal arbitrage batteries that Hari was talking about. It could be in the form of hydrogen. It could be a form of, long duration, storage batteries. Any more questions?
Awesome. Thank you.